Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I recently went stash diving and decided I wanted to knit the Vellichor by Andrea Mowry. I included this pattern in my 2021 sweater and knitting plans video because it's been in my queue for a while and I think it's a cool sweater. This is a popular pattern with an interesting texture, and since it uses 3 colors, I thought it would be a great project to use up some stash yarn that I didn't know what to make with. I don't have a huge yarn stash, but what I do have mostly consists of random one-off skeins that are perfect for like a shawl, but are kind of difficult to put together for a sweater. And I find myself making way more sweaters than I do shawls now. These are 2 skeins that I've had in my stash for a while. This one I picked up on a road trip several years ago, and this one I picked up in a Webs sale. And I love both colors, and I thought that they were kind of an unconventional pair. So I was looking for like a neutral color to go with these 2, and I found this skein from Hue Logo, which I picked up from a D stash. And I thought this color looked really nice. I like the way that the cooler toned gray matches with these warmer toned contrast colors. But I only have 1 skein of this, and unfortunately this skein is so old that the colorway she makes now isn't quite the same. So this was kind of out of the picture. However, when I was looking through my stash, I found this yarn, which is leftover from my Raina shawl, which is actually right behind me. And this single skein is not quite enough yarn for the sweater that I want to knit, but I have this left over, which is about 45 grams, so it's almost half of a skein. So in total, I have about 475 yards of this main color. And for the sweater that I want to knit, I need about 500 yards. So I think I'm just going to crop the sweater and make this work because I really do want to work from stash for this sweater. So this is my color palette for this sweater. I think it's very autumnal and I'm pretty excited for it. This pinkish purplish yarn is from Blue Savannah. It is indie dyed yarn. It's also single ply, which I don't often use in a sweater. I've actually never used single ply in a sweater. So even though single ply is not nearly as durable as applied yarn, I do feel okay about using this as a contrasting color in my sweater. And then same for this like burnt orange color. This is also single ply. I was originally planning this for a shawl, but that hasn't happened yet, and this skein is still in my stash, so changing plans. And this is Cloud9 Fibre's Filo, I believe, and I think the colorway is Londontown. And then the gray, or the main color yarn that I'm using, is the Fibre Cumbria fingering. And this is a 3-ply worsted spun wool mohair blend. So I think this is going to be the perfect yarn for the main color of the Vellichor. So I think I have just enough yarn for this sweater. I may need to play around with the gauge or the length and maybe a couple of other things to make sure that I don't run out of that gray. If I do run out, that is a readily available yarn that I could purchase, but I would be using such a small amount of an extra skein that I do really want to try to make this work, and the challenge here is to use up yarn that I already have. So hopefully I don't have to purchase any more yarn, but that is an option just in case. So one thing I like to do before I begin a project is open up the pattern, read through it, take a look at the needle size, the gauge, any notes. I also like to look at the construction if I haven't done that yet, as well as any schematics that are included. And I like to just make sure that I'm understanding what I'm about to do, understanding the steps, maybe the techniques involved, looking up any tutorials that I need to. So in this pattern, she has some tips for choosing the size of your sweater, and there's also links to a German twisted cast-on tutorial and a 3-needle bind-off tutorial. I also like to highlight my size throughout the pattern. I know this is a common thing to do. And if you have a PDF reader or PDF editor, you can select your size and use the highlight tool. And this just helps with ease of working through the pattern so that you stay consistent and you can easily reference which size you're knitting, which is especially helpful if there are a lot of sizes. It looks like it is a relatively basic construction. It's knit bottom up and in the round until you get to the armholes, and then you separate for the front and back and knit them flat. And there's also a note that the front and back are the exact same, so there's no shaping. And the neckline is a boat neck shape, so when you seam the shoulders, you just stop right when you get to the neck and leave a hole open for the neck. It's a drop shoulder, so the sleeves are just cuffs that you pick up and knit, and that's pretty much it. So the last thing I need to decide is in what order I'm going to use my contrasting colors, and I'm hoping that swatching will help me make that decision.
I didn't get any footage of me knitting my swatch, but when I blocked it, I left the swatch attached to the skeins because I wanted to conserve as much yarn as possible and rip out my swatch when I was done. So you can see here when I blocked it, I put my swatch in some warm water and I left the skeins to the right of the sink as I blocked my swatch. This is how it turned out. I liked the contrast colors in this sequence and how it's looking, so I decided to move forward with this yarn choice. This type of swatch is a swatch to find your circular gauge, so you knit right side rows only and strand the yarn on the back. And I'll put some links on swatching in the round in the description box, but the key element here is that you always want to swatch in the method that you'll be knitting your garment. When you knit a circular gauge swatch, your edge stitches will be sloppy, so to make sure I'm still getting an accurate gauge, I knit about 5 edge stitches in stockinette, and this allows me to measure the full stitch pattern with an accurate gauge. Normally, you would cut the stranded yarn on the back of the swatch so that it lays entirely flat, but in this case, as I mentioned, I wanted to rip out my swatch and reuse the yarn, so I actually didn't cut the yarn. But knitting those extra edge stitches gave me a pretty good indication of my gauge, and since this is a stash busting project, I decided this was close enough for me. Some people do like to soak their crinkly yarn after ripping out knitting. I have never had a problem with just re-knitting it, but keep in mind if you were working something like a stockinette in a loose gauge, that might affect how your knitting looks until you block it, or possibly your gauge itself. When I start a new project, I like to gather all of my materials in one place and set them in a basket or a bag. It doesn't have to be fancy, I just like to have everything I need with me. This includes yarn, needles, my notions pouch, any other tools I might need, and I also sometimes like to write down some details about what I'm knitting, such as the yarn I'm using and maybe the yardage, what size I'm knitting, any modifications I plan to make. And I try to log all of this in Ravelry, but it also helps me to write it down somewhere because I like to refer to these notes when I'm sharing my projects on YouTube, and it's nice for quick reference. Alright, so it's finally time to actually cast on. All of these cast on techniques I will be using are from Patty Lyons, who is an amazing knitting teacher and designer. I will link the video series she did on casting on. I'm using a long tail cast on, and since this is a bottom-up sweater knit in the round, I have a lot of stitches to cast on. So what I'm doing is measuring a 6-inch tail and then wrapping the yarn around my needle 10 times and marking how much yarn that took. Then in that exact spot, I'll make a slip knot and cast on 10 stitches in pattern. Once I've cast on my stitches, I'll measure my tail and make sure that it's 6 inches so that I know that wrapping my yarn 10 times produces enough length for 10 stitches. I'll take my length of yarn and count by 10 until I have enough yarn for my cast on. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And once I have enough yarn for all of my stitches, I'll begin casting on. I want to cast on in pattern, and the rib for this sweater is knit, knit, purl, knit, purl. To keep me on track with all of the stitches I'm casting on, every 20 stitches, I'll stop and add a stitch marker. So if I lose my place, I can just go back and count my stitches by 20. And I'm just going to continue casting on. So here I have 20, 40, 60, 80 stitches. This is my last set of 20 stitches, and you can see here that I'm left with quite a bit of extra tail yarn. And that's to be expected. This technique doesn't give you the exact amount of yarn you need. It just prevents you from running out of yarn, and it gives you a ballpark on the length that you need. You can just cut this off so you don't have a super long tail, but sometimes, especially if I'm trying to conserve yarn and I might need this for seaming later, I'll tie the yarn up in a bobbin so that it just sits here as I knit. So I finished casting on. All I need to do now is make sure that my stitches aren't twisted, because you can't untwist once you start knitting. Place a beginning of round marker and start my pattern. Here's the start of my sweater. I think it's looking great, and I'm having a lot of fun working on it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.